Good evening and welcome to the second community design workshop for Envision New Kent. Many of you may know that this workshop is part of our project team developing a strategic long-range plan for New Kent County that will help the county make decisions. So tonight, our discussion will focus on sharing some concepts for possible development patterns that balance rural character and growth. Next slide. Next. So based upon the information that we've collected so far and the many discussions that we've had with stakeholders since January, we have had leaders and residents and many people work with us in developing this strategic plan. So what we've done is that we have consolidated 5 topics that we are going to include in the overall plan. And you can see these here. They are infrastructure, growth management, quality of life, governance, and resilience. And of those 5 themes, the growth management and quality of life, as you can see here, deal specifically with land management, community design, and rural character. And that's what we are working with at our workshop this week and next week. Next. So let's talk a little bit about what we talked about on Monday. Monday, we discussed the important features that define rural character, as well as also some of those important areas that we need to look at in New Kent County that were the most important for managing growth. Tonight, we are going to focus on sharing some design principles and some very preliminary potential development examples that we believe will show you how you can balance rural character and growth. And then of course, next week, it's going to be very intense, but we hope to be able to refine these concepts and discuss with you some potential tools for managing growth and development. Next. So managing and enhancing rural character of New Kent County has been a frequent topic of discussion with many of the stakeholders and as the survey participants. And rural character can mean many things, from open fields and pastures to natural features to even quaint towns and historic places. Next. The poll that you responded to on Monday evening really helped us understand more about what those rural character features were that citizens of New Kent cherished. And so that both in the natural environment as well as the built environment. So you can see here of the participants that polled on Monday evening, natural landscapes and habitats were very important, as well as attractive landscapes along the roads and rivers and streams. And then in terms of the built environment, it was villages with commerce and pedestrian access, as well as historic buildings and places and recreational areas and trails. So you can see that there is a variety of different elements that we as designers need to understand what is important and how we consider them for future development. Next. There are also very different development patterns in New Kent County, and it's important for us to understand which ones were the ones that were most important to you. And so some of these important areas may include things like community commercial areas, residential neighborhoods, villages, business parks, interstate commercial interchanges, and even the road corridors. Next. So from the poll on Monday evening, your feedback really helped us identify which areas that we want to work in first that are the most important to you. And you can see from the slide that many people were very interested in understanding how to manage growth in the village commercial centers And those are in New Kent, Providence Forge, Bottoms Bridge, and then the interstate interchanges. Next. Your feedback was also important to us in helping us understand what you wanted to see in development patterns. And so from this slide, you can see that many people enjoyed the landscape and wanted buildings set back from the road, either in terms of planted landscape or retained forested buffers. But also it was important to be able to have buildings with architectural character and landscaped and forested corridors. Next. So it's important to really understand that today the comprehensive plan, which was adopted in 2012, has a future land use map, and that this map actually is a guide to how the county wants to grow in the future. And that future date is 2040. But the central focus of the county's comprehensive plan was to maintain the attractive rural character of the county while providing opportunities for the creation of income and wealth in the community. So the long-range plan, it's important to point out that it incorporated a 2009 green infrastructure plan, which really provided technical insight into the special green, cultural, and recreational features of the county. And it also established conservation areas. So this future land use map, because it built on the green infrastructure plan, it actually established areas for growth. The comprehensive plan did, established areas for growth near the interstate interchanges, and it identified areas that were to be served by public facilities, both in the short term and in the long term. And some of these areas to be included in public facilities were New Kent, Bottoms Bridge, and some of the economic opportunity areas. It also established desired development forms and land uses for things that are referred to as villages, hamlets, rural crossroads, and commercial and industrial sites. So you can see in this map, so here's the village of New Kent, Providence Forge, Bottoms Bridge, and then Eltham was also identified as a village. And then some of the hamlets were in Lenexa and Barhamsville. And then your economic growth areas are here along Route 33 and Route 30, where near the Weir Creek Industrial Park. Next.
So, we've started to study these types of development patterns, and also tried to work very carefully with the things that people really wanted us to emphasize in the survey that was recently done. And this image kind of kicks off the next part of this conversation, which is, what might the future of New Kent look like? And it may start to show future development patterns being clustered like you see in this sketch, where you see very dense villages. But what that does for you is to preserve that rural countryside beyond. The rural countryside seems to come up over and over again as a very important aspect of New Kent County, and one that is cherished and wanted to be conserved as we move forward. Next, Aaron. And so just to get you up to speed with our process, we've been sheltering in our offices and in our homes over the last 2 days, and we'll continue to do so over next week. So we're about 2 to 3 days into an 8-day process. So I thought I'd give you a little tour of the kitchen here as we're cooking this, and you can see we've all been working at our desks there. You've got an incredibly talented design team, including Greg and Andy and Ross and Maria. And then if Aaron will hit the advance button, you can see Evie stays connected to us all, helping us call the shots here as we move forward. So we're going to show you a lot of stuff today. It's almost like going in the kitchen when they're preparing your meal. We're going to show you some things that are ingredients of what might eventually be the plan. And so bear with us here, knowing we're just getting started, and would appreciate your comments and guidance as to which of these ideas may resonate well and which ones maybe we should leave back in the kitchen. So if we can move on to the next slide, I'll use a couple of examples as we enter this. This is called a transect diagram, and it was originally initiated by a company called Dwani Platter Zyberg, and you'll talk. A number of planners have adopted this. It's almost like a vocabulary that we all tend to use when we're discussing orderly and planned development. T1 or Transect Area 1 is natural areas. New Kent has a lot of those. It also has a lot of T2, which is rural housing and farmstead. Right now, T3 is the more suburban zones, and right now I believe we have in New Kent County a number of planned unit developments which were created in the first decade of the 21st century, and they have yet to fill up. But as many as about 7,000 home sites are already on the map, just have not been fulfilled, and most of those are in the T3 zone. You have a lot of housing available there. As places get denser and denser and get more organized, T4 tends to be where you might find a little bit denser places, and then of course T5 is real urban. We won't be getting there, but we may start to look a little bit toward T4 for a few select places in our development to absorb density. And next slide, Aaron, will show another very a scholarly person about these subjects, a fellow named Randall Arendt, has written a number of books on rural landscape preservation. And he looks at it a little differently, but with similar results. On these three pictures that he put together, I think helped to understand some of our studies. On the left is sort of a typical existing country crossroads. You have a number of these in New Kent County. It's seen from the air, and it has a house or two and some fields and some forests. The picture in the middle shows what could happen to that scene if it was developed with typical 2-acre zoning. And a lot of counties have in place, 2-acre, 5-acre zoning in an attempt to try to make things feel rural. But sometimes that actually has a counterproductive result, and that it kind of creates sprawl. And he suggests the picture on the right, more of a village zoning pattern, where you see over there against the woods a couple of denser areas that's where you cluster the development so that you can keep that countryside that's so important in a place like New Kent County. Okay, next picture, please. And so some of the things that we're starting to study, and you realize this is just kind of conceptual, is do well-intentioned codes work counter to what the county wants to achieve, or counter to the county's strategies? For example, if you use that 2 to 5 acre zoning, and you look at this map, the yellow indicates zoned property, and then the houses, which are the brown squares, tend to be spread out all over the property. The next slide will indicate the same number of houses, one more please, the same number of houses, there they are, in what we call a cluster subdivision. In this case, they're packed tighter, and things like that stream and the trees remain. So rather than everybody getting out and mowing 2 acres, you have smaller lots, but the major natural resources are preserved. So this is something we may look at in New Kent County. You have that beautiful green infrastructure plan that starts to show these important places to preserve it. So it may be something to consider. Next slide, please. And some of your neighboring counties have considered this kind of approach. The next 2 slides, this one and the next one, show what might happen with 9 houses is if they were planned in a typical conventional subdivision. That is a 2 acre minimum lot size. This only allows for 15% open space, and you get about 1 house for every 2 acres. The next slide shows if you find the things you want to save, like the wooded open space or the pasture, how you might cluster those houses. This particular drawing gets you 75% open space, has a 1 acre maximum lot size, and you still get a total gross density of 1 dwelling per 2 acres. The difference is a lot of this is still open and scenic. Okay, next slide. So if you take that idea of that sort of neighborhood cluster and you exaggerate that up to an entire residential planned community, this drawing shows an example of how you might take some of these principles and sort of blow it up to the size of a true planned community. So what you see in this drawing, you'll see those little cottage clusters, say over on the far left side of the drawing. There are a couple over there. And then you'll see a planned village in the middle. The village itself might have a variety of housing types. And this is one of the things that we notice might be helpful for New Kent County. You have a number of single family houses, but places where there might be small pockets of apartments or potentially townhouses or smaller cottage style lots might be appropriate to help them mix. And then you'll also notice in this center is that we call these live work buildings. This is where you might have housing over top of commercial uses. It's really important to get your commercial uses into the denser part of your housing developments, because this is so people can walk to the store or walk to the dentist office, and it's all easily accessed rather than having to get in the car and drive, a half hour across the county to get to something. So there are also a couple of things here that might not be quite as obvious, but Aaron, if you'll hit the next button, you'll see 3 areas here which are developed as part of the neighborhoods, but they're also developed in concert with the community to get things like playgrounds or open greens. So that's a tiny part of the development. It's an amenity, but it helps the county to reach some of its goals, like more places for playgrounds. Then if you hit it again, you'll see another very important piece, which is the open space along the main road is put into a type of land use that is consistent with what it had been. For example, hay fields or wetlands, so that part pushes the main focus of the development back a little bit, so that front is still part of the scenic landscape of the county. And the next advance will show that there's a trail network built into the community, which is part of the entire project, and it connects everything. So even if you live on the very last lot, you can jump on your bike or jump on the scooter and get to the town center, and so it's connected. So some of these ideas, I think, make a lot of sense for future planned communities in New Kent as you go forward. Okay, next image, please. Now, we also notice that sometimes in the regulations, while trying to, to be good to everybody, it can also create other issues. For example, in this study, once you have a 50-foot, the upper picture indicates you have a 50-foot right-of-way, but then you have 12-foot utility setbacks for pipe utilities, and then another 10-foot setback for electrical utilities if they're underground. And so and then the buildings themselves are set back 35 feet from the right of way. So you end up with over, 94 feet, a clear swath with no trees, and the houses even have to be set back another, I think it's 13 feet beyond that. So you get this tremendous sort of landing strip look to your community. Whereas if you get in and do custom setbacks, you may find a place to put a utility corridor, for example, that isn't along the street right away, that allows you to preserve large trees and bring buildings in a lot closer if you want to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, next one. But we notice also that part of what we do when we think about communities that really want to leave a lasting historic and preserved landscape is it's what the public sees from the road. So there may be ways to take future ordinances and write them that provide these kind of views from the road that tend to remain unencumbered or with scenery tucked back, with the housing tucked back into the scenery. Okay, next, Aaron. Also, people have noticed that it's not only in the daytime that this is important, but just simple additions to your rules and regulations might direct night sky friendly lighting, which just points it down where we all are rather than up into the stars, so that we can keep that beautiful night scenery in New Kent County. Okay, next. Okay, so as we think about hamlets and villages and crossroads, we need to start thinking about how much development can a village or a hamlet absorb. You can't just build the world's biggest hamlet, it would ruin itself. So as we start to study typical Virginia hamlets, we'll start to develop some guidelines as to how big they can be and how they can be laid out. The next picture indicates, using those new urbanist principles that we mentioned, one possibility for a way that a village might grow. Red, village core, that's what we would call T4 back from that earlier drawing. Village residential, that's T3. And then village conservation is T2 as you sort of get out to the countryside, so that you cluster your density in the middle of the place. You can see there this diagram, there are 3-story buildings there. And then as you transition back out to the countryside, you have houses more like you see along rural roads. So this is kind of a diagram that planners can use to discuss these kind of things. In this case, you get about 145 units on this 50 acres. And the next picture indicates what it looks like, when it's finished. So you can start to see it looks like a true Virginia village with the pastures and the forest intact. But what we've done is to cluster the development in the center there. Okay, next picture. Now, in the center of a village, what you start to get is a healthy contrast to that rural scenery. And so here, for example, and we're just starting this study, you'll start to see the more historic referencing building forms. You'll start to see the wider sidewalks here, where people can walk from building to building with seats outside and small signage. And you'll also start to see how the large landscape beyond kind of hosts this. But what you'll start to see when you dissect this and start to look at how you make this happen is that you may have something in the code, for example, that would require a build to line rather than the traditional set back line. We would like the buildings built to the back of the sidewalks rather than having this kind of setback of 30 or 50 feet, which when you really think about it, it really doesn't make a lot of sense for these kind of places. So next slide, please. Okay, so if our goal is to preserve rural open space, and I know we keep talking about that, but it keeps coming back from our public surveys, then we do some actions like you absorb the potential development demand in hamlets, villages, crossroads. And so you consider incentives or regulations to increase the density in these settlements. But at the same time, you consider incentives and regulations for land conservation in high priority areas. These are areas like the very important natural resources areas, highly scenic areas, areas along the public right-of-ways or roadways. And then the final piece of this puzzle would be to proactively seek conservation development partners. This kind of work is not for everybody, and you would proactively try to find developers who are really good at this, and also members of the nonprofit community who can help to get this done. Okay, next picture. So Ross has put together this map for us, and it just starts as a little bit of a refresher. Where are your villages, hamlets, and crossroads? And you can see here that the 2 hamlets that are identified in the current comprehensive plan. There are 6 villages, and there are a number of the smaller pink crossroads, actually just several here that are showing up on the map. Okay, next picture. So what should a village look like? And this is a direct answer to some of the survey responses that we got earlier this week. They're modeled on a traditional classic Virginia rural village, just like we showed. You absorb the development pressure to save the rural space. You may see a variety of housing types. It's a very walkable village. You walk to commercial community buildings, and it's connected to everything by trails and signage and good sidewalks. The other thing is when you start to cluster these kind of development patterns, you can actually achieve a savings on utilities. And so you can make these more like your communication hotspots, and you can invest in other developed utilities here. Okay, next picture. And what you'll start to see as we start to look at this is, you'll start to see more traditional building forms like 2, maybe even 3-story in some cases, buildings with these public common areas between. Okay, next picture. What's a hamlet look like? Similar, a hamlet is it's a settlement that is a little smaller than a village, and we might start to define that a little bit more clearly as we move forward. Again, they absorb the development pressure with a variety of housing types, walk to commercial buildings and connected just like the others, and is also a place where you can go ahead and invest in communication hotspots. Next picture. What's a crossroads look like? And this is the smallest of the 3. The picture up there at the top was our top vote getter on what a crossroads might look like. Again, you cluster the density, you direct vehicular circulation and parking. One of the things about a crossroads is when they're in their early state, people just kind of drift on in casually to the front of the old store, for example. But once you get several of them, it actually gets kind of dangerous, and so you have to clean that up. So we organize the planting, the lighting, pedestrian facilities. We again have mixed use. These are just smaller than villages or hamlets, and they may have design guidelines. So the next picture shows, how we're starting to study what a crossroads could look like. The one on the left is with a traffic circle, and the one on the right is the more old-fashioned type without the traffic circle. But in each of these drawings, what you'll start to see is some of these principles being put into place, like you organize the parking so it's either behind a berm or maybe even behind the building so that you can move the buildings up close to the intersection. Just barely sketched on there, but you can see them, are a coordinated system of sidewalks, crosswalks, because if you want to walk from one of these places to the other, you need, it needs to be safe. This is also where you might see investments in lighting or landscaping so that the entire place makes people want to slow down as they go through the crossroads. We call it traffic calming. Okay, next plate. What should a business park look like? I found it interesting that the top vote getter picture that you see up here on the top right is a business park, but you can't even see any of the businesses. But that's actually a pretty cool business park, and it showed us what we might want to do here in New Kent County. For example, maybe there is a parkway corridor through it, so it feels like you're in a park. Buildings are in the background. We use the natural resources there as some of the amenities, whether there might be wetlands or a stream running through, something like that. Organize the parking with lighting and signage. And part of business park planning, good business park planning, you also plan for things that your employees are going to need, like childcare. Maybe there's a park exercise place in there, business support services. Where do we go to get something in UPS overnight, or where do we go to get a coffee or something like that? And then finally, you bring amenities like trails into it so that employees, will have something to do during breaks, and you make it a real pleasant place to work. Okay, next picture. So you start to see how we start to incorporate those principles into business park design. You'll see the parkway there going through, a setback with berms, so you hide large service or parking areas, building setback a bit, so it does feel like you're truly in a park. These are pretty easy to implement and follow, but we just have to all agree on. Okay, next one. What should an interchange commercial area look like? Now, we've been talking about villages, hamlets, crossroads. They've been around ever since before the United States. They're old English settlement patterns, right? but we now have our very own all-American invented type of settlement. It's called the interstate interchange. And New Kent County has several of them. You know, I-64 goes right through the middle of the county. And so you can either not pay attention and wish it would go away, or you can take a more of an opportunity approach here and say, we're going to take those interstate interchanges and welcome people to our county. So they may have welcoming landscaped boulevard, landscaped business frontages, buildings with architectural character, you know, the coordinated sign and lighting standards, and you may require more dense development patterns. The next slide indicates starting to look at these a little bit. You know, this one, for example, this is one in New Kent County. It's about inside the picture here is 240 acres. Just to give you some idea, you can see the interchange up there at the top, and a couple of facilities have opened up around there. And so you've got 240 acres here, and you see about 30,000 square feet built out. Now, planners also talk about floor area ratios to think about density, and this is one of the least dense developed areas in the whole county. The next plate will indicate, you know, where are the buildings, and they're these little yellow squares. Very little of the picture is filled with buildings. And so one of the things to consider is if you really want to control sprawl, this may be one of the areas where you may want to direct development. So the next picture indicates, see those yellow squares again, this would be a study. The yellow squares are the existing buildings, and you can see kind of in white drawn around there are the parking areas, etc. But in addition to that, once you really start to provide incentives and regulations to bump up the density at these places, but you do it in a very planned way. So you would have a gateway boulevard in the center, and you see the trees and things like that there. You would require or propose or incentivize guideline infill highway-oriented commercial. These are the same things as the existing land uses. It's just more of them clustered here. Along with this, you sort of draw a line in the sand and say, we don't want you sprawling out 2-3 miles down that route. We want you right in here. Has a central welcome green, and this, you know, this sketch would result in about 700% more efficient land use. It would, and those orange buildings there show about 250,000 square feet. So you reduce sprawl, and you take the opportunity to make this a destination welcome area for visitors, because this is where they're all coming. They'll come right here, make it welcoming. Okay, next picture, please. One more. Okay, now we've talked about these developments, but one of the most important things in your county is the areas that aren't developed. And so we need to think very strategically about how we preserve those. And one of the things that I've seen over my career, and I think a lot of others have too, is that if you start to extend utilities to places, and on this little sketch, you know, a typical crossroads on the left, a hamlet, a village, but the blue indicates where you might take piped utilities, particularly water and sewer. So if you know, to link them together, and if you do that without really thinking about it, you're going to create sprawl along those roads. So the next picture indicates, you know, once you extend those, you got to have a plan in place to consider land use regulations, maybe scenic easements, things like this along that utility corridor, because it will have a lot of pressure to develop unless you help to contain it. So the next plate indicates, you know, you want those drives between your settled areas to keep that kind of really nice countryside feeling that's very important to New Kent County. Okay, so and one of the final things that we'll start to do as we look at this is, now that you have some really good tools in place, like the green infrastructure plan, we may require a more thoughtful or process-oriented land development process, so that you get to keep some of these things that are lots more important to the county as you have future development occur. Okay, next, please. Okay, so, and Evie, you might help me with this one. In summary, the guided development is proposed in villages, hamlets, crossroads, interchange areas, and business parks. You have these 5 key areas that you might guide development to. With that, and paired with it, guided conservation landscape, that is, design principles for conserving rural environments while the county grows. So what we'll be working on next week, if this is the right direction, is how do you work on these buildable areas and provide measurable growth? How do you guide the development patterns and connect them with green infrastructure to retain that county identity and sense of place? And we'll be focusing on building and land development forms, which will eventually set up the next revision of the county's comprehensive plan. The strategic plan is sort of at the top, and after that you go and revise comp plan, and after that you think about other development regulations revisions. Evie, any more comments on that?
I think you kind of talked about most of it, David. Good job.
Okay. So I believe I'm going to hand you the baton, Evie. I believe the next couple of slides are yours.
Okay, so our next workshop session is next week on Thursday, July the 2nd. Please note that we changed that to 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I know that that's kind of an odd time, but we really felt that if we had it at 6 p.m., that it would really interfere with people wanting to basically wind down for the 4th of July holiday. So we thought that we would do it at 3 o'clock. And that is Facebook Live. And we're going to be talking about refined community design concepts from what you saw this evening, plus maybe some additional ones that can show you how perhaps a village can be built out and made a little bit more denser and give you the measurable growth that David has kind of talked about. And then in particular, we are also going to be talking about the development tools and share with you what some communities have used and what might be appropriate for New Kent County. So please mark your calendar, especially that 3 o'clock time. Of course, it will be on Facebook Live, so you can watch it really at your leisure. And it's also available on our virtual website. And so if you want to continue the discussion after tonight, we will be continuing to update our Envision New Kent virtual studio page, and that is www.envisionnkc.com. And there are also discussions going on Facebook in Envision New Kent. So there are comments opportunities in both of those locations for you to add additional comments and for you to find out more information. And I guess now we're at a point where we will ask Ross and Maria to share with us any questions that people may have posed during the conversation. So Maria and Ross, do we have any significant questions that perhaps you want to share?
We did not have any questions, just a couple of technical difficulties. I think there's some storming going on down there, but no questions as of now.
All right. Well, with that, we very, very much appreciate you taking the time out tonight. And we hope that what we've presented to you has been something that is thoughtful and that has made you recognize that maybe there are ways to be able to preserve the rural character of New Kent while also growing the county in a way that makes it a great quality of life place for you and your family. And so with that, we will see you next week on Thursday at 3 o'clock. Thank you very much. Bye.